Everett Parrish was 42 years old, and he had learned early that the quietest rooms hold the most weight. Not silence as absence, silence as structure. The kind that gets built over years of early mornings and cold coffee and decisions made without anyone watching, because nobody thought to watch. He had lived by that understanding for 9 years. 9 years of leaving the house on Elgin Street before the sun cleared the rooftops. 9 years of calloused palms and sawdust in the creases of his knuckles that no amount of scrubbing quite reached. 9 years of steering money and patience into places his wife had never thought to look. Because she had long since decided she already knew what she was looking at. Then, on a Wednesday evening in November, standing in the front hallway of their house in the Glebe neighborhood of Ottawa, he heard 28 words that made all 9 of those years go suddenly, completely clear. His wife, Vivienne, no. Not his wife anymore in any way that mattered. His wife, Paulette Drummond, stood before the hallway mirror in a charcoal wrap dress, adjusting an earring with the practiced ease of a woman preparing to be somewhere important. Her coat was already on. Her expression was already elsewhere. She looked at him through the mirror, not at him directly. Through the reflection, the way you look at a piece of furniture you are deciding whether to replace. Everett. Her voice was even, unhurried. The awards dinner tonight is not really your kind of thing. You'd just feel out of place. A small pause. I'm taking Stefan. Stefan Albrecht was 31 years old, and he worked in government relations, and he owned exactly the kind of slim-cut jacket that signals ambition without having yet produced evidence of it. Paulette adjusted the second earring. You understand. It's professional. The door closed. Everett stood in the hallway. The radiator clicked. Somewhere upstairs, the pipe shifted the way old houses do in November, settling against the cold. Her perfume was still in the air, something expensive that he had never been able to name. He did not move for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard. The maple he had planted the year they moved in had gone bare, all the color already down. He thought, 9 years. He thought, she has never once asked. He did not think small. That was the thing about Everett Parrish that people who had not taken the time to know him consistently failed to account for. He was not small. He had simply never needed anyone to know that. He set down the glass, went upstairs, opened the closet, and took out the charcoal suit he had not worn since the previous spring. His daughter had told him it was the best thing he owned. She had said it the way young people say things that are accurate but understated because they assume you already know. He did not call ahead. He simply got in the truck, the old F-150, not the other vehicle, the one Paulette had never noticed in the garage because she had never had reason to open that door, and drove. Before the full story, let me say this plainly. If you have ever poured yourself into something real, while the person closest to you decided you were merely convenient, stay right here. Because what happened that evening at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier on Wellington Street is the kind of thing that changes not just a marriage, but a whole room's understanding of what it means to actually see a person. The first thing people noticed about Everett Parrish, when they noticed him at all, was the hands. Not his height, though he had it. Not his face, though it was good. The kind that has already thought through what you are about to say before you have finished saying it. The hands, broad, roughened, with the permanent shadow of wood stain along the knuckles that registered as a shorthand for everything about him before anyone had spoken a word. Psychologists call this attribute substitution. The mind reaches for the most visible surface-level signal and uses it as a proxy for the whole person. The work clothes, the truck, the smell of fresh-cut cedar, fast, efficient, and almost always wrong in the ways that matter most. Paulette had been running that shortcut for 6 of their 9 years together. He had built Parrish custom millwork from a single rented unit on Industrial Avenue into one of the most respected woodworking operations in the Ottawa Valley. Residential cabinetry at first, then commercial fit-outs, then restoration work for heritage buildings. The kind of contract that required both technical precision and patience that most shops didn't have. He employed 23 people. He had expanded into a second facility in Canada 18 months ago. He had not mentioned either of these things to Paulette, not out of strategy, but because she had stopped asking about his work years before, and he had stopped volunteering what was no longer welcome. She believed, genuinely, that he ran a small carpentry business that paid adequately and not impressively. She had introduced him to colleagues as, "My husband, he does woodwork," with a tone that closed the subject as pleasantly as possible. He had smiled, because there is a kind of person built enough of themselves from the inside that condescension simply finds nothing to grip. What Paulette did not know, what she had never thought to ask, was that 3 years earlier, through a cushion formed over a job restoring the original fir floors of a downtown heritage property, Everett had been introduced to a woman named Colette Marchand. Colette ran a mid-sized real estate investment company called Marchand Equity Group with offices on Spark Street. The restoration project had taken 6 months. Over those 6 months, Colette had watched Everett work, not casually, carefully, the way people who have spent their careers identifying undervalued assets learn to look. She had made him an offer at the end of the job. A private equity stake in a commercial development project in Hintonburg, in exchange for project management of all interior construction. Everett had agreed. He had directed capital from the millwork company steadily, quietly, year after year. What began as a single project partnership had grown, through Colette's expansion and Everett's consistent reinvestment, into a meaningful ownership stake in Marchand Equity itself. When the Ottawa Business Excellence Awards were announced in October, Marchand Equity Group was nominated in 3 categories, including the flagship award for regional business leadership. Colette's acceptance speech, should they win, was going to include acknowledgement of the company's founding partners. Everett's name was on that list. Paulette had been nominated in a separate category, Communications Strategy Firm of the Year, for the agency she ran. She had known about the awards dinner for months. She had RSVP'd for 2. Then she had changed the RSVP. She had told the organizing committee she was bringing a colleague named Stefan Albrecht instead of her husband. The organizing committee had noted this. Colette Marchand had noticed the note. She had texted Everett 3 weeks before the dinner. Just 2 sentences. "I saw the guest list revision. Is everything all right?" He had replied, "I'll be there. Reserve me a place at the table if you can." Her reply, "Already done." Has been, actually. 3 weeks before the awards dinner, Everett had come home early. It was a Tuesday, gray and cold, and he came in through the side door the way he always did. He heard Paulette's voice through the office door. Precise. The register she used for business. "Stefan, the timeline still works. He has no idea what the asset base actually looks like. The financial disclosure in a separation would be straightforward. The house, the business, the joint accounts. His lawyer will have to make a case for valuation, and by then we'll have already restructured what matters. It's manageable." Everett stood in the hallway for a long moment. He was not shocked. That was the accurate word. Not shocked. There is a difference between discovering something and having what you already half knew arrive in plain language. He had been half knowing this for perhaps a year. Maybe longer. What struck him, standing in that hallway with the cold stills on his coat, was not anger. It was something more like the completion of a calculation he hadn't wanted to finish. Paulette was not a cruel person by nature. She was a frightened one. He had watched her become someone who confused the appearance of success with its substance, until the distinctions stopped being visible to her. The fear of being dismissed, the fear that had driven her up from modest beginnings in Sudbury, that had made her formidable and bright and relentless, had long since curdled into something that couldn't recognize genuine value when it was sitting across the dinner table from her every night. Psychologists call this scarcity orientation. a cognitive pattern in which the drive to secure more becomes indistinguishable from the fear of having less, until gratitude itself begins to register as complacency. The people who love you quietly become fixtures. The ones who perform loudly become possibilities. He walked back through the side door without making a sound. That evening, he drove to his workshop on Industrial Avenue, sat at the old workbench with a cup of tea going cold, and thought for a long time, not planning, just arriving somewhere clear. Later in the week, he stopped by a retired couple in Westboro whose front door had been swelling and sticking since August. Fixed the frame, planed the edge, refinished the threshold. They offered to pay. He said, "Don't worry about it." On the way home, he dropped off a box of groceries at a family he knew through one of his employees, a single father in Vanier dealing with a medical leave and a gap between support payments and monthly costs. He did not announce this. He did not think of it as meaningful in any particular way. He simply knew there was a gap, and he could fill it, and so he did. He did these things the way he had always done them, without ceremony, without needing them to be part of a story. The Fairmont Chateau Laurier in November has a particular quality of light. The limestone walls, the high ceilings, the chandeliers catching the warmth of a room full of people in good suits, it gives the place a specific gravity. People walk in and recalibrate. Some feel elevated. Others immediately begin calculating where they stand relative to the room. Paulette Drummond arrived at 6:45 with Stefan at her side. Burgundy dress, hair up, the practiced entrance of a woman who has been walking into important rooms for 15 years. Stefan followed half a step behind, attentive in the way of people who understand that tonight's performance has a specific audience. She worked the pre-dinner reception with efficiency. The handshakes, the warmth calculated to the right temperature. A colleague asked after her husband. She tilted her head with gracious regret. He doesn't really do these events. He's more comfortable at the shop. A small, fond smile that contained no actual fondness. I brought someone who actually fits in here. Stefan smiled on cue. 2 tables over, someone on the awards committee leaned toward a colleague and murmured something about a name change on the guest list. His colleague shrugged. Dinner was served at 7:30. At the head table, beside Colette Marchand, one chair sat empty and conspicuously reserved. At 8:15, Colette rose. The room settled the way it always does for people who have earned their authority over years and don't feel the need to announce it. "Good evening. Before we move into the formal awards, there is a recognition I've been waiting to make for some time." Paulette set down her fork. Something in the tone caught. "I'd like to ask someone to join me at this podium. Someone who has been, since the earliest days of Marchand Equity's growth, not just a financial partner, but the steadiest voice in the room when things were uncertain. A builder in every sense of the word." She looked up. "Everett Parrish. Please come forward." The room went quiet, the way rooms do when they are recalibrating. From near the back, moving through the parted space with the unhurried ease of a man who has absolutely nowhere to rush, came a tall figure in a charcoal suit. Broad through the shoulders, calm in the face, the hands, slightly roughened even now, resting easy at his sides. Paulette's wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth. Stefan leaned toward her. She said, "Don't." Everett reached the podium. He and Colette shook hands the way people do when they have genuinely trusted each other through difficult seasons, which is its own distinct thing and visible from across a room. He looked out. He let the quiet hold for a moment. Not for effect, simply because he was not in a hurry. "My name is Everett Parrish. I run a millwork company on Industrial Avenue. Most mornings I have sawdust on my hands." A pause. I mention that as context, not apology. A few warm sounds from the room, the kind of response that comes from recognition rather than courtesy. 7 years ago, through a restoration project that taught me more about patience than I expected to learn, I was introduced to Colette Marchand and to what Marchand Equity was trying to build. I believed in it. I invested in it. Over those 7 years, that investment grew in ways I am genuinely proud of. not because of what it means for me personally, but because of what the company has done with it. He paused. I'm sharing this tonight because certain developments in my private life have made it no longer appropriate for me to stay in the background. He looked briefly, directly, at Paulette's table, not with anger, with simple clarity. As of last month, I hold a 31% equity stake in Marchand Equity Group, which makes me the company's second largest individual shareholder. The room did not react loudly. It went still. And in that stillness, almost involuntarily, the attention in the room turned toward Paulette Drummond. She did not move. Psychologists describe this moment when the internal narrative a person has constructed becomes suddenly, violently incompatible with available reality as cognitive dissonance collapse. The story Paulette had maintained for years was, she was the one building something. He was background. That story had just been taken apart, quietly and completely, in front of 200 people. I am also announcing tonight, Everett continued, the establishment of the Parish Skills Bursary in partnership with Algonquin College's Trades and Technology program to support students from lower-income households in the Ottawa region pursuing skilled trade certification. My father worked as an electrician in this city for 31 years. He believed the work you do with your hands is as worthy as any other kind, and that a person's postal code should not determine whether they get the chance to prove it. He stepped back. The applause built slowly and then held. The standing ovation began in pieces and assembled itself before people seemed to have decided to stand. Colette was smiling the way people smile when something long overdue has finally been said out loud. At her table, Paulette sat with her champagne glass in her hand, perfectly still, while the room rearranged itself around a truth she had never once thought to look for. Stefan leaned close. Paulette, did you know any of? She said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Everett walked to the head table, sat in the reserved chair, the one that had been there all along. What Colette shared next, about the financial irregularities that had been discovered in the communications firm's recent contract with Marchand Equity, and about something Everett had done quietly for Paulette's younger sister 2 years earlier, is what made several people in that room go completely silent in the particular way of people confronting something that cannot be undone. There is a specific quality of quiet that settles over a room when the social performance ends and something real is left standing in its place. Not silence. The ordinary sounds continued. Cutlery, the distant murmur of the kitchen, someone near the east wall making remarks about Q3 results that nobody was tracking. But underneath all of it was a register that had not been there an hour before. Stefan Albrecht had refilled his wine glass 3 times in 20 minutes. That was its own kind of commentary. Paulette sat upright, years of professional habit keeping her composed in the visible architecture of her posture. But she was watching the head table, and Everett was not looking at her. He was in conversation with Colette, unhurried, unperformed. Somehow the fact that he was not watching her made things considerably worse. Psychologists call it anticipated regret, not the pain of what has happened, but the pain of suddenly understanding what you have already done and cannot undo. The separation paperwork, the phone call with Stefan, the calculation about assets and valuation, and what a lawyer could argue. All of it was still real, and now it was sitting inside a context that had changed shape entirely around it. At 9, Colette returned to the microphone. There is one more matter the board felt it was important to address this evening. A matter of professional integrity. She nodded to the AV desk. The screen lit up. A financial document. Tabular, detailed, with 3 columns of figures that several people at the surrounding tables leaned forward to read. Over the past 14 months, Marchand Equity experienced a series of irregularities in the consulting contracts managed through our communications and public affairs budget. A forensic review completed in October traced the source. She looked up. The individual responsible for structuring and approving those contracts was Stefan Albrecht. The name dropped into the room like something solid. Stefan went rigid. His expression moved through surprise, then calculation, then a fixed quality that was doing considerable work. The hand on the wine glass was not entirely steady. Around the table, people turned, slowly, the way a turn of the head in a quiet room can carry the weight of a verdict. Paulette turned last. This was a different expression from the one she had worn 45 minutes earlier. That had been the shock of a collapsing story. This was something colder and more specific. The recognition of a woman who has just understood that the man she chose, the man she had called an upgrade, the professional fit, the person who actually belonged at this level, had been using her as a door, a useful means of access to accounts and relationships she controlled. He had not chosen her because she was exceptional. He had chosen her because of what she could open. This is what researchers describe as the dark triad in practice. Manipulation and self-interest packaged inside social ease, so polished it presents as genuine attention. Stefan had never once looked at her and seen a person. He had looked at her and seen a set of keys. The matter has been referred to the Ottawa Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit, Colette said. Mr. Albrecht will address these findings through the appropriate process. She paused. But there is something else I want to share tonight. Near the side wall, among the guests at auxiliary tables, a young woman sat with her hands folded in her lap. Perhaps 26, in a dress that was carefully chosen and slightly too formal for the room. The way you dress when you are not used to rooms like this, but you wanted to get it right. Her name was Mireille, Paulette's younger sister. She had grown up in the same house in Sudbury. She had not had Paulette's drive or her specific capacity for reinvention, but she had her own version of both, quieter and less certain of itself. 2 years ago, she had been diagnosed with a degenerative condition affecting her vision. The treatment was available. The cost was not. Paulette had told her she would look into options. She had told herself the same. But looking had required admitting the distance between the life she performed and the one she was actually navigating, and that was not an admission she was structured to make. She had not known what Everett had done. Everett came back to the microphone. He did not build to it, he simply said it. 2 years ago, through a private medical fund, the full cost of vision preservation treatment for a patient at the Ottawa Eye Institute was covered anonymously. Surgery, ongoing specialist appointments, adaptive equipment, follow-up care. The total came to just over $280,000. The room was completely still. That patient was Mireille Drummond, Paulette's sister. He paused for a moment. I am sharing this now not to cause harm, but because the full truth is the only ground worth standing on. I paid for her sister's treatment, while my wife was consulting a lawyer about how to restructure my assets in a separation. The room did not react with satisfaction. It reacted with something quieter and more specifically human. Jonathan Haidt describes this as moral elevation. The response we feel when we witness genuine virtue that has gone unannounced and unrewarded. A warmth in the chest, a tightening in the throat. It is one of the most distinctly human emotional responses, and it cannot be manufactured. Every person in that room felt some version of it. From near the side wall, Mireille Drummond stood. She moved carefully through the tables. She would always move carefully now, though the treatment had held, and people stepped back without needing to be asked. She walked to the front. Everett came down from the stage to meet her. She put her arms around him. The microphone was still open. Thank you, she said. I never stopped thanking you. I never knew what to do with how much there was to thank. He held on for a moment. He didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Somewhere toward the back of the room, a senior partner at one of the accounting firms was studying the centerpiece arrangement with unusual focus. 2 people near the east table were not looking at anything in particular with considerable effort. Paulette was crying, not the composed kind. Both hands pressed to her face, shoulders moving, the careful architecture of the evening's presentation entirely gone. Beside her, Stefan Albrecht, with his financial crimes referral and his government relations vocabulary, had absolutely nothing useful to offer. The fit, the upgrade, the person who actually belonged at this level. Publicly, thoroughly, quietly demolished. Later, near the coat check, Stefan attempted a version of an explanation. Something about the money being temporary, about a plan for repayment, about the pressures of the industry. A board member cut him off. You told people you'd just closed on a condo in Westboro. What plan? Stefan had no answer. The performance had been the entire structure. Remove the signals, and there was nothing inside to hold the shape. Everett found Paulette near the lobby. She had reconstructed some version of composure by sheer force of habit, eyes hollow underneath it. She saw him coming and straightened. He stopped in front of her. He was not angry. He was not forgiving. He was simply and completely clear. You told people I was fine for a weekend but not ready for a room like this, he said quietly. Look at what Stefan was ready for. A pause. There is a difference between building something and performing the appearance of it. Tonight, everyone in this room saw what that difference looks like. He collected his coat from the check, walked out through the front doors into the November dark. The canal was somewhere to the south, the cold coming off the water. He could not see it, but he knew it was there. Consequences have their own pace. They rarely arrive the way drama does, all at once. More often they come the way November comes to Ottawa. Gradual, steady, a lowering of temperature that you don't fully register until you realize the warmth has been gone for some time. The months after the awards dinner moved like that. Stefan Albrecht was removed from every relevant professional body within a week of the police referral. His explanations, offered nervously through his lawyer, confirmed the irregularities in detail while attempting to minimize a total that turned out to be difficult to minimize. By February, he was in a one-bedroom rental on the wrong side of Merivale Road, managing his legal costs with the specific misery of a person who built their identity from external signals and is now living in their absence. The constructed identity, researchers note, is assembled from surface signals, the address, the jacket, the vocabulary of success. It photographs well, but it has no load-bearing structure. Remove the signals and the whole thing collapses because there was never anything beneath to hold it up. Paulette's agency experienced its own version of this. Several clients conducted reviews in January. 2 medium-sized contracts were not renewed. The Marchand equity retainer was formally ended by the board. These things were not catastrophes in isolation. Together they were a recalibration. The professional network she had spent 15 years building turned out to be more attached to her position than to her, which is a discovery that most people who confuse the two eventually make, though rarely in such concentrated form. The separation was filed in December. Everett did not fight over the house. He moved without drama to a renovated heritage unit on a quiet street in Hintonburg, exposed brick, original maple floors that he had restored himself before moving in, a small backyard where he intended to eventually build a workshop. The kind of place that suited him far better than the Glebe House had ever suited either of them. The emergency board meeting at Marchand Equity was held in January. 13 people, 1 agenda item, a shortfall that required immediate and structured response. Everett arrived alone in the same charcoal suit. He placed a proposal on the table. Specific, realistic, covering the gap, and providing 18 months of clear runway for restructuring. Enough to protect the company. Enough to protect the 41 people who came to work there and had been entirely tangential to every decision that created this problem. One condition. Paulette read it in the second page. She understood it before she reached the end of the paragraph. As a condition of this capital injection, the agency's managing director will formally and publicly acknowledge her role in the introduction and professional sponsorship of the individual whose conduct created the current liability. This acknowledgement will be made in a full meeting of relevant stakeholders, not through a press release, not through a spokesperson, but in person and on record. There is a meaningful distinction between punishment and consequence. Punishment is personal. It satisfies the person administering it. Consequence is structural. It restores what was broken in the institution rather than simply in the individual. Everett was not trying to humiliate Paulette. He was requiring that the woman who had publicly performed authority account for its failure with the same transparency she had demanded for its success. That is not cruelty. That is accountability held to a consistent standard. Around the table, 13 people studied their documents with careful neutrality. Paulette picked up the pen. She signed. The acknowledgement was delivered 3 days later in a full meeting of her agency's clients, staff, and key partners. She read her prepared statement in a clear voice that cost her something visible. When she finished, the room offered the complicated, uneven applause of people who have just witnessed something that required courage, even compelled courage, the kind that leaves you with something you can keep, regardless of how it arrived. Everett was not in the room. He had not asked to be. In the weeks that followed, Paulette's business community quietly reorganized itself around her absence from certain circles, as communities do. Some connections turned out to have been structural rather than personal. That discovery is a particular kind of education, and she was receiving it in the most efficient possible format. But she was not done. That was the accurate thing to say about Paulette Drummond. She was frightened, and she was capable, and she was, for the first time in a long while, beginning to allow those two facts to exist in the same room without one consuming the other. She found a therapist in the Byward Market area. She went for 2 months before she stopped telling herself she didn't need it. Then she went with slightly less resistance, and then with none, and then with something approaching genuine curiosity about the version of herself that might exist on the other side of the work. The fear of poverty that had driven her entire adult life was still present. It was simply no longer the only voice in the room. Whether she would fully arrive somewhere better was a story being written in real time. But she was at least writing it honestly. That was something. Mireille called Everett every few weeks. They talked the way people talk who have been through something serious together and come out with a different understanding of what serious means. She called him every few weeks, and he always had time, and she always hung up feeling like the world was slightly more solid than it had been before she called. One afternoon in late February, Paulette drove to Industrial Avenue. She sat in her car outside Parish Custom Millwork for a long time, long enough for the engine to go cold. Then she got out. Inside, Everett was at the back workbench with one of his apprentices, a young woman named Claudette, 18, from Vania, who had enrolled in the trade's bursary program at Algonquin and was doing her shop hours here. He was showing her how to read the grain of a piece of white ash before cutting, talking her through it, letting her make the decision. Paulette stepped onto the concrete floor, her heels, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. Everett looked up. She didn't make a speech. She didn't have one prepared. She lowered herself onto the edge of the workbench, which was not the most dignified position, and her coat touched the wood surface and she did not reach to adjust it. And she said his name, and she said she was sorry, and she meant it the way you can only mean something when every other version of the story has been tried and found to be insufficient. Everett stood slowly, set down the hand plane with the deliberateness of a man who does not perform urgency. Looked at her. "You told your colleagues I was fine for weekends," he said. Not unkindly, just clearly. "You told a room full of people I didn't fit." He glanced around at the workshop, the tools on their proper hooks, the light coming through the clerestory windows, the smell of something being made from raw material into something useful. "Look where we're both standing right now." She had no answer. There wasn't one. He handed her a clean shop rag, not as forgiveness, as a practical gesture from someone who is decent even when he has no obligation to be. Then he turned back to Claudette and the piece of white ash and continued the lesson. October came back to Ottawa, the way it always does, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of light that the valley gets in autumn, low-angled and amber, hitting the limestone buildings along the canal in a way that makes the city look older and more patient than it actually is. The maples along the Rideau River path at their full color. The mornings cold, the afternoons still generous. Everett Parrish was standing in the open bay of his shop on Industrial Avenue, the same as always, sawdust on his forearms, a specific calm in his eyes that had not been there 12 months before. Not the calm of a man who had won something. The calm of a man who had found something and understood the difference. He was working through a joinery problem with one of the new apprentices, a young man named Remy, 20. Impatient in the specific way of people who are quick enough to see the answer before they understand why it's the answer. "You're not just cutting the joint," Everett told him. "You're reading what the wood wants to do. That's a skill that doesn't stay in the shop. You'll use it everywhere you go." Remy considered this. That sounds like something that would be on a poster somewhere. "Posters are fine," Everett said. "People only say they're not because they haven't had to earn the lesson yet." Remy thought about this longer than expected. "Okay, yeah, that's actually different." Everett handed him the marking gauge without further comment. The Parish Skills Bursary had placed its first cohort of 11 students at Algonquin in September. The second cohort had a waiting list. Colette Marchand had come to the launch event and spoken briefly and well. Remy's tuition was covered by the bursary. He didn't know it came from Everett specifically. He just knew someone had decided he was worth the investment, and he had not quite finished deciding what to do with that. Everett taught the Thursday morning shop session himself. He intended to keep doing so. He wanted the students to see that the person who funded the program was the same person who showed up in work, clothes, and got sawdust on his hands. That the distance between where they were and where they might go was real but not impossible. That the most useful thing you could do on any given Thursday morning was show up and do the work. His father had lived that way. Everett intended to pass it on the only way it can actually be passed on, not through speeches, but through demonstration. He had met someone, quietly and sideways and without announcement, the way the good things in his adult life had generally arrived. Her name was Harriet Lone. She was an architect with a firm on Sussex Drive, 40 years old, precise in the way of people who work with structure, with a warmth that showed up in specific ways rather than being broadcast generally. She had come into the shop in June looking for someone to fabricate a custom installation for a residential heritage project she was managing on the Glebe side of the canal. She had looked at his portfolio for 20 minutes. Then she had said, "You understand how old buildings want to be treated. That's not common." He had smiled. "I've been listening to them for a while." She had given him the contract. She had also come back in August to talk through a second project, and then in September for coffee at the place on Bank Street where the booths were quiet and the espresso was reliably good, and the conversations had run long past their stated purposes both times. She had never asked about the awards dinner. She had heard something of it, the way you hear things in a city the size of Ottawa, where the professional networks are smaller than they appear. But she didn't bring it up because it was not relevant to who Everett was. It was relevant to what he had been through. She knew the difference between those two things, and the fact that she knew it was not something he had had to explain to her. What she saw was the man who arrived at the shop before his staff every morning. The man who had a list in his head of people who needed something and quietly managed to have what they needed. The man who, when she had asked what he was most proud of, had thought for a long moment and said, "When one of my apprentices opens their own shop, that's what I'm working toward." She had looked at him. "You're a genuinely good person. I hope that's something you actually know about yourself." "I'm not sure I'm remarkable," he said. "That," she said, "is precisely what I mean." Positive psychology has documented this with some care. Authentic humility, not performed modesty, but the actual absence of the need to be seen as exceptional is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term psychological well-being. People who don't require external validation to feel settled in themselves are, measurably and consistently, happier. Not because their circumstances are better, because their sense of themselves does not depend on circumstances. Everett Parrish had never needed to be seen as remarkable. He had needed to build something real, care for people genuinely, and go home at the end of the day with clean hands. In the metaphorical sense, the sawdust was at this point a permanent condition. That had always been enough. On a late October afternoon, Everett sat on the small deck behind the Hintonburg unit, a cup of tea going pleasantly cool on the railing, the maple across the fence at full amber. Harriet beside him, reading something on her phone, occasionally making the small sound she made when she was about to say something worth hearing. He thought about his father, about what it means to build something that lasts, not the structure itself, but the intention behind it. The decision to put your hands to something real and stay with it when it's difficult and keep going when there is no audience. That decision, made quietly and consistently over years, is not dramatic. It does not generate headlines. It does not read as impressive until the moment it becomes undeniable. But it is, in the end, the only kind of building that holds. He thought about Rémi, who had come in frustrated last Thursday and left calm, because sometimes the most useful thing in the world is a problem that has a real solution. He thought about the waiting list for the second cohort. He thought about Harriet, who was now making the small sound, and he waited for what came next, which was invariably worth waiting for. He set down his tea. He recognized, genuinely happy. Not the relieved kind, and not the triumphant kind. The actual kind. The quiet, solid, built from the ground up kind that has no need for an audience, because it was never assembled for one. This is what the story of Everett Parrish leaves behind, quietly and specifically. The people in your life who do not announce themselves, who work without requiring acknowledgement, who give without presenting you with the receipt. Look at those people again. Look carefully. The ones making the least noise are very often the ones holding up the most weight. And if you are the one who has been quiet, if you have been building something real while someone nearby decided you were simply convenient, don't change, don't shrink, don't perform. Keep your hands on the work. The foundation you are building will outlast every opinion anyone ever held about it. The truth does not require your assistance. It only requires your patience.